Welcome everyone, good morning, good evening and good afternoon. Please take a seat. Take a seat as I am still dressed up for today. I have to run out of the house soon as the IRS is about to knock down my door and chase me for my crimes. So for today, on Tuesday, we are approaching the reset day in NA and tomorrow will be one for EU as well. So as we have gone through a full week now of the beginning of the season, it is time to start drawing some conclusions. Very preliminary, of course, but for today, we're going to start drawing some conclusions about what we have been seeing in the raid. And then tomorrow, for EU's reset, we're going to be drawing some conclusions for the Mythic Plus first week of the season. So this is coming, of course, as we have checked out yesterday with a round of hot fixes, buffs and nerfs coming in this next reset. So we will see likely some more changes after what we will be checking out today in terms of how things have been going in the raid so far. We can start, of course, as usual, as when we go and look at these type of things, we can start with the popularity. So to see just how many players are playing which specs at the moment in the raid, since it's very early on and this was the week where Heroic and Normal opened at the same time as Mythic, way more guilds have been invested into Heroic rather than jumping immediately into Mythic. We are checking both of them, we are checking both of the popularities for both difficulties. This is the current popularity for the Heroic Vault of the Incarnates when it comes to the DPS. We do see quite a few familiar faces. As you remember, we started checking before, even before the release of the season, which specs were being leveled and geared past 365 item level, and then the week after that past 375 item level. And for example, this is what we got when it came to DPS. As you see, even a week and a couple of weeks ago, the high number of players who were playing Havoc, were playing Fury Warrior, were playing Outlaw Rogue, they were also playing Demonology Warlock, they were also playing Balance Druid, and they were also playing Devastation Evoker. When you go and look at how it's actually playing out in the raid, most of these specs are still there. We have one outlier, of course, which is Marksmanship, and that's because Marksmanship has been recently buffed. So basically Marksmanship and Beast Mastery swapped places, even though Beast Mastery is not that unpopular, is definitely taking the lead in that regard. And also Arcane Mage, which also has been growing over time as more and more mage players had to give up trying to play Frost, trying to play the chilled, laid back, couple of buttons rotations and try to get into the Arcane playstyle. Many of the mage players are not still very convinced in going Arcane, but at the very least when it comes to the raid, it does look like it's a clear option over Frost Mage, with of course Fire being much lower down. That was already known and expected. And nicely enough, most of the other specs are still more or less where we expected them to be before the season launched. So you see things like Affliction and Survival and Destruction at the bottom of the popularity, even in Heroic, without even having to start min-maxing Mythic raid compositions. They are still not really played that much overall. What if we do start to min-max the compositions and start looking at Mythic raid so far? Now, we don't really have that much data for Mythic because most of the data in here will be for the first couple of bosses primarily, so for Aranog and for the Primal Council being the two bosses being progressed on the most right now in this first week of the raid being open. So many of the numbers, many of the names are going to be the same. Once again, you do see similar specs being at the top. Of course, the major difference is that Marksmanship and Demonology and Arcane and Balance are all at the top. So what a surprise, the ranged DPS, when it comes to having to make a 20-man group for Mythic raiding, the ranged DPS start to become way more broad. This is a tradition of raiding. In case you're new to raiding and you have never paid that much attention to this, traditionally speaking, ranged DPS are more used and more brought into a raid composition because they make handling mechanics more easy, because most of the mechanics will be at range, will be about dividing yourselves into groups, will be about spreading, will be about moving around, and it's generally speaking easier if you are a ranged DPS to do so rather than being a melee DPS. So as soon as we enter into Mythic, we see the melee specs losing out a bit in popularity over the ranged specs. At the bottom we do of course see still the same specs as expected. If you're not very played in Heroic, it's unlikely you will make a massive jump into Mythic, so a round of applause to the Brave 6, the Brave 6 players, the 3 Affliction and the 3 Survival players who went into Mythic raiding. That took a lot of guts to do so, or a lot of money to bribe your raid leader. Or maybe you are the raid leader yourself. That is perhaps why you got into Mythic raiding this week. Besides that, most of the other picks have remained more or less on the same level of popularity, of representation compared to their Heroic counterpart. Now, we have looked at the DPS. Let's also take a quick look at the tanks and the healers, since there is much less of them and there is going to be less surprises, especially when it comes to tanks. Because tanks don't really change between Heroic and Mythic. Tanks still have this type of composition, which has Protection Warrior, Blood Death Knight and Vengeance Demon Hunter as the top 3 tanks. In both Heroic and Mythic, they have a decent enough gap from the bottom 3, being Brewmaster, Guardian Druid and Protection Paladin. So, as we said multiple times, most of the times the meta of tanks in the raid is going to be shaped by the meta of tanks in Mythic Plus, because that's what most tanks will be aiming to play. So whatever is the most meta tank in Mythic Plus is more likely to also have some spot in the raid, or alternatively, the other way to slot a tank into a raid is based on which types of buffs or debuffs, raid buffs or raid debuffs your raid is missing. So, for example, it's likely that Protection Warrior can come off as very handy if you don't have DPS Warriors in your group to bring you a Rallying Cry or to bring you a Battle Shout, for example. If by some miracle you don't have Havoc Demon Hunters, you can bring a Vengeance for the magical damage debuff. So that is also why sometimes some of the tanks can become quite mandatory in the raid in terms of picks. In this case, it's less so about that and more about them being better and being, generally speaking, more popular, as we will see likely tomorrow when it comes to Mythic Plus. This is also a similar ranking we could make when it comes to the popularity in Mythic Plus of tanks, for example. While tanks are not moving much in popularity, we do have some more interesting changes when it comes to healers, because this is the situation of healers in Heroic. So once again, the two of the, generally speaking, more popular picks for Heroic and lesser type of content raiding, Resto Druid and Holy Priest, are handily at the top when it comes to Heroic. Other specs like Preservation is very close right after them, and then a bit of a gap below them is Holy Paladin, and then we start getting larger and larger gaps down the bottom half of healers with Restoration Shaman, Mistweaver and Discipline. We do see quite the change when we move from Heroic to Mythic. So unlike tanks, which don't really change with the swap in difficulty, healers in Mythic raiding change significantly, because Holy Paladin, for example, goes from 4th to 1st, and then Resto Druid goes from 1st to 4th. There is basically a switcheroo. While the bottom stays more or less the same, Discipline, Restoration Shaman and Mistweaver are still very tied towards the bottom. You do have the swap to Holy Paladin being much more played in Mythic. Now, this might have a very simple explanation. While in Heroic is not perhaps as important, or perhaps with more players doing Heroic runs, it's more easy to find more Paladins, but in Mythic, as we saw, Protection Paladin is not very popular, it's not going to be the pick to be your tank, and Retribution Paladin is also in the bottom half of the popularity. So, there is now a question: where do we get our mandatory Devotion Aura to pick for the raid? If you don't have a Blood Paladin and you don't have a Red Paladin, then it comes by itself that you will need a Holy Paladin. Meanwhile, Resto Druid is not nearly as needed, because as we saw, Balanced Druid is more than enough popular. It's in the top 3, top 4 of popular picks for the raid. So you have your Mark of the Wild in the raid. From the Balanced Druid, you don't need to bring yourself a Resto Druid to cover that buff. So it's much more likely that you're gonna be needing a Holy Paladin in your Mythic raid comp than you will be needing a Restoration Druid. That is where we get the gap in popularity going from Heroic to Mythic. But enough with the popularity, let's look at some of the first week performances from the DPS, starting with them. This is also something we mentioned in yesterday's balance tuning video. This is the performance in Heroic as of today. As we see, triple rogue at the top. What we also see is triple rogue at the top, we see Windwalker, we see Enhancement, and then Fury, and then Ret, with the only combo breaker being Marksmanship Hunter. So we are looking right here at 7 different melee specs at the top of performance, with just one ranged hunter breaking the combo. So quite the melee DPS heavy top. Of course, if there is a melee DPS heavy top, it's more likely there's going to be a ranged DPS heavy bottom. You go to the bottom and we see a quintuple pack of ranged DPS. Double mage, double warlock, and a priest in the middle. Obviously, for some of these, you might guess which spec is which. For example, Arcane being the more popular of the mage picks, and Frost and Fire being very loosely played, means that in here Arcane is the better performing of the 3 specs. Very similarly, with Fury Warrior being very popular and Arms Warrior not being nearly as much, we can also see in here that Fury Warrior is performing quite well in the rankings so far. We can also continue the usual tradition of Balanced Druid being super popular despite their performance not being nearly as exciting. This is something we have seen throughout Shadowlands. Every time we were checking the performance of the specs in the raid, we always had Balanced Druid towards the top of the popularity and also towards the bottom of the performance. Now we are seeing something perhaps not nearly as bad as last expansion, but definitely not one of the breathtaking performers so far when it comes to raid performance in Heroic, because now we move on to Mythic. Obviously, these numbers are still scarce. Obviously, these numbers are still not just small, but also for just a couple of bosses, basically. So some of these results are going to be similar to what we have already seen. For example, this time we have just 2 of the rogue specs at the top, whereas Assassination is not doing nearly as well. Marksmanship is still at the top. You have Windwalker and Enhancement also at the top. But some of these performances you see here can get warped by the type of fight. So it depends on which bosses you're fighting that give you this type of result. For example, Primal Council is a type of fight where you are hitting 4 enemies at the same time for the entirety of the fight. You will be looking at something like this. This is the damage of the players in Primal Council fight. And you can see, for example, Balanced Druid being able to Starfall and spread their dots constantly on 4 targets at all times, now doing much better. Marksmanship Hunter, one of their weaknesses is large. Large targets AoE, but Primal Council is just 4 targets, so they are doing just fine. Enhancement also has a pretty good time on hitting 4 targets. Shadow Priest, Frost Death Knight as well, on constantly cleaving onto 4 targets. So these results are very polarized towards just hitting 4 targets. We can then look on more or less the complete opposite, which is Eranog, the first boss of the raid, which is much more of a single target focused fight. Yes, you have the ads spawning every now and again, but that's just for padding. What we care in here is the boss damage. And this is the boss damage of Eranog. Now we can see something completely different, because previously, for example, Balanced Druid on hitting 4 targets was towards the top. Fury Warrior was also doing just fine. Marksmanship Hunter, of course, was doing very well. We also had Havoc Demon Hunter towards the top. You also had other specs performing well as long as it was about hitting 4 targets. Now these are results just for boss damage. And you can see, not that surprisingly, Assassination Rogue, the premier single target spec of the rogues since like Mists of Pandaria, doing very well in single target. Arcane Mage is also one of the better specs in single target. Surprisingly, we see Enhancement Shaman. Enhancement Shaman was towards the top on hitting 4 targets, and it is still towards the top on hitting 1 target, still performing very well. Unholy Death Knight goes from being in the bottom 5 of specs on hitting 4 targets to being in the top 4 of specs on boss damage on Eranog, and this is to show how much can the rankings, so to speak, swing based on how many bosses get defeated by more and more guilds, depending on which type of fights they have. If it's a pure single target fight, if it's a pure padding AoE fight, then the general overall rankings are going to change wildly based on how many logs there will be about a certain fight. For example, these rankings right here, the overall rankings are bound to change wildly next week, once the next boss in line for progression, Terros, starts getting defeated by multiple guilds. Why? Because Terros is a pure 100% single target fight. So of course, all of the specs being better at single target will start growing significantly in the overall rankings, and all of the specs being traditionally better at AoE damage, cleave damage and whatnot will do, of course, much worse overall. And that will continue until we get more and more bosses defeated with all of their different types of damage profiles. But for today, this is what we have seen so far when it comes to the raid. Most of the rankings, most of the popularity picks have more or less remained the same from what we have checked before the release of the season. The few changes had to do with the buffs and nerfs coming out, like for example with Marksmanship Hunter suddenly gaining more and more popularity because of their buff. For example, most of the other picks remained popular as we expected from our initial inspection, so Havoc, Fury, Windwalker, Demonology, Arcane Mage, Marksmanship Hunter, as well as Beastmastery Hunter still being popular. Those have remained more or less the same. We can say more or less the same thing for healers as well. Preservation Evoker, Restoration Druid, Holy Paladin in the raid, Holy Priest as well. And for tanks, of course, Protection Warrior leading the way, followed by Vengeance and Blood Death Knight. We have kept more or less the same when it comes to popularity compared to what we were expecting before the release of the season. This is what we have for today when it comes to our first week's raid inspection at the end of this reset. Waiting for the next reset and more data, more numbers, and then we will see eventually later on we will have another recap of what's been going on in the raid. But for today, we are going to take a break and we're going to stop here. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of my Patreon supporters for contributing and helping the growth of this channel. You can support, of course, in other ways that don't include having to spend money. Liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to this channel, are perfectly acceptable ways to show your support. You can also support even more by following me on Twitter. If you ever want to be notified and check out whenever I start streaming, for example, that would be a good way to keep track of it. You can still support me by subscribing to my Patreon to get access to my Discord server as well. And lastly, of course, I nowadays stream on Twitch, generally speaking starting from 10 p.m. Central European times, 1 p.m. Pacific and 4 p.m. Eastern US time zones. So with all of this type of social media bubble out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I have to go. I already hear knocking on the door. I have to run out of the window.